In this lesson, we will learn about Azure Resource Organizations. First, we will be introduced a diagram about Azure Resource Organization. Then we will learn about its individual components, Azure resources, resource groups, subscriptions, management groups. Finally, we will conclude our lesson with the review questions. Here is a typical diagram on Azure Resource Organization. As you can see, at the top level is the root management group, and under the root management group can be management groups or subscriptions, and under a subscription or resource groups, and under a resource group or Azure resources. We will learn more about these components in the next slides. As you may know, an Azure resource is created with specific functions and is usually used by customers to build applications and IT systems. Azure resources consume storage space and computing power on the cloud systems of Microsoft and are charged back to customers. An Azure resource must be created in one and only one resource group. However, it can be moved from one resource group to another. For example, we can create these three Azure resources in the network resource group like this, and we can create these three Azure resources in the infra resource group like this. As you can see, each Azure resource can only be existed in one resource group at a time. For example, we cannot create this Azure button in the network resource group and in the infra resource group like this. This action is not possible. However, we can migrate the Azure button from the network resource group to the infra resource group like this. So what is an Azure resource group? An Azure resource group is a logical grouping of one or more Azure resources. When a resource is created in a resource group, Azure generates a pointer to link the resource to the resource group. For example, when we create this Azure VNet in the network resource group, Azure will generate a pointer to link the VNet to the network resource group like this. Resource groups cannot be nested, which means it is not possible to create a resource group in another resource group. For example, there is no way we can create a new resource group in the network resource group like this. This action is not possible. Resource groups must be created in a subscription. For example, we must create these two resource groups in a subscription like this. When actions, policies, and permissions are applied to a resource group, they will be applied to all Azure resources in the resource group. For example, when we delete the infra resource group, all the resources within the infra resource group will be deleted along with the infra resource group. Let's learn about Azure subscriptions. Subscriptions allow to logically organize Azure resource groups and facilitate billing. There are two types of subscription boundaries. The first one is the billing boundary. This subscription type determines how an Azure account is billed for using Azure resources. The second type is access control boundary. Azure applies access management policies at the subscription level. Subscriptions are independent from each other and cannot be nested. Many subscriptions can be linked to different or to the same Entra ID tenant, but a subscription can be linked to only one Entra ID tenant at a time. The Entra ID tenant provides its users with authenticated and authorized access to Azure resources in the subscriptions linked to it. So what is an Azure management group? A management group allows to logically grouping other management groups and subscriptions. Management groups are created to simplify access management and Azure policy deployment. This is extremely useful when you have so many subscriptions. You can deploy the policies and permissions at the root management groups, and the policy and the permissions will be applied to the management groups, the subscriptions, the resource groups, and Azure resources underneath it. Here are important facts about management groups. Up to 10,000 management groups can be created in a single directory. A management group tree can support up to 6 levels of depth. This limit doesn't include the root level or the subscription level. Each management group can support only one parent, which means you cannot create a new management group like this because it will make this management group have two parents. So this creation is not supported. Let's conclude our lesson with the review questions.